There's nothing that breaks a father's heart quite like watching his children go to bed hungry. When 58-year-old Clarence Johnson whispered those devastating words in his empty barn, "I can't feed them anymore," he thought no one could. Hear his shame. Clarence had worked the same Georgia pig farm for 37 years. He'd buried his wife, raised 3 kids alone, and never asked anyone for help. The drought destroyed his crops. The bills kept coming. His children's eyes grew dimmer each day. That October evening, standing in the shadows, millionaire Alexander Langston heard every broken word. Alexander had money, but he also had something more valuable: the wisdom to know that sometimes helping others helps heal your own wounds. When the cruel farm owner's daughter called Clarence lazy and worthless, Alexander stepped forward. What he offered wasn't just money. It was a chance for both men to discover what really matters. But would Clarence's pride allow him to accept what could save his family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the red clay of Whitfield County, Georgia, where the Johnson family pig farm had weathered nearly 4 decades under Clarence's weathered hands. At 5:30 sharp, just as he had every morning since 1987, Clarence pulled on his father's old work boots, cracked leather that had seen 3 generations of honest labor, and stepped into a world that grew smaller with each passing season. The boots were all he had left of his daddy, Samuel Johnson Sr., who'd worked these same fields until arthritis bent his spine like a question mark. Before that, Clarence's grandfather had tended this land with nothing but hope and determination, back when a black man's word and work ethic meant something to the folks who signed the paychecks. Now those same worn souls carried the weight of dreams deferred and promises he wasn't sure he could keep. The air still held the crisp bite of autumn, and Clarence's breath formed small clouds as he made his way toward the pig pens. 43 zoos and their spring litters greeted him with familiar grunts and squeals, their pink snouts pressed against the wooden slats he'd repaired more times than he could count. These animals depended on him, just like his children did, but the feed bills kept climbing, while the prices for his pigs stayed flat. His wife, Sarah, used to walk this path with him, her slight frame bundled in one of his old jackets, carrying a thermos of coffee that could wake the dead. She'd had a way of making even the hardest mornings feel like adventures, pointing out how the sunrise painted the barn different colors, or how the newest piglets had grown overnight. 7 years had passed since cancer took her, but Clarence still caught himself looking for her silhouette in the morning mist. "Daddy, you want some eggs?" The voice belonged to Lily, his 12-year-old daughter, who stood in the farmhouse doorway wearing a dress 2 sizes too big, a hand-me-down from the church clothing drive. Her dark hair was braided neat and tight, the way Sarah used to do, though Clarence's clumsy fingers never quite managed the same perfection. "That'd be fine, baby girl," Clarence called back, forcing warmth into his voice despite the cold knot in his stomach. He'd checked the refrigerator before dawn. 3 eggs left, half a loaf of bread, and some milk that would turn sour by evening. Lily didn't need to know that her breakfast might be the only real meal any of them got today. Inside the weathered farmhouse that Sarah had tried so hard to make into a home, 16-year-old Marcus sat at the kitchen table with textbooks spread around him like a fortress. The boy had his mother's sharp mind and his grandfather's stubborn streak, qualities that served him well in his advanced placement classes, but made him chafe against their circumstances like a caged bird. "Coach Williams called last night," Marcus said without looking up from his chemistry homework. "Said the recruiter from Georgia Tech wants to visit next month." Clarence paused in the doorway, coffee mug halfway to his lips. College had been Sarah's dream for all their children, but especially for Marcus, whose grades could open doors that stayed locked for most kids from families like theirs. The boy was smart enough to earn scholarships, but smart enough to know they couldn't afford the things scholarships didn't cover. "That's real good, son," Clarence managed, though the words felt heavy in his mouth. How could he tell his boy that? College applications cost money they didn't have, that even with financial aid, there would be expenses that could break them. How could he admit that Marcus might need to work instead of study, just to keep food on the table? 8-year-old Samuel emerged from the bedroom he shared with Marcus, rubbing sleep from eyes that seemed too large for his thin face. The youngest. Johnson had always been smaller than other kids his age, and lately Clarence noticed how Samuel's clothes hung loose on his narrow frame. Growing boys needed more than hope and good intentions. They needed protein and vegetables, and the kind of nourishment that required money Clarence didn't have. The school had sent home a notice about free lunch programs, but Clarence's pride had crumpled the paper and thrown it in the trash. 3 generations of Johnson men had never taken handouts, had never asked for anything they couldn't earn with their own sweat and determination. But pride was a luxury he was learning they could no longer afford. 20 miles away, in the climate-controlled comfort of his Mercedes sedan, Alexander Langston reviewed quarterly reports while his driver navigated the winding country roads toward the Whitfield property development meeting. At 42, Alexander had built a technology empire by recognizing patterns other people missed, by finding value in overlooked opportunities. His portfolio included urban renewal projects, sustainable energy ventures, and agricultural innovations that turned struggling farms into profitable enterprises. But success had come at a cost he was only beginning to understand. His marriage had ended 2 years ago, when his wife decided she preferred the idea of being married to a millionaire rather than actually living with one. His relationship with his own father had died along with the old man, buried under years of resentment and misunderstood intentions. Now, engaged to Victoria Whitfield, daughter of Georgia's largest agricultural conglomerate, Alexander found himself questioning whether he was repeating his parents' mistakes. Victoria embodied everything. His world valued beauty, breeding, and the kind of social connections that opened doors before you even knocked. She wore designer clothes like armor and spoke with the confident authority of someone who'd never been told no. Their engagement had been featured in Southern Living magazine, complete with photos of their planned spring wedding at her family's antebellum mansion. But sometimes, in quiet moments like this morning drive, Alexander wondered if Victoria saw him as a person or just another acquisition for her family's empire. She had a way of dismissing things that didn't fit her worldview, of speaking about people like they were problems to be solved rather than human beings with stories and struggles that mattered. The Whitfield property sprawled across 3,000 acres of prime Georgia farmland, most of it leased to tenant farmers who worked the soil their grandfathers had worked. Alexander's development company was considering a partnership that would modernize the operation, bring in sustainable farming practices, and create jobs for the local community. It was the kind of project that looked good on paper, and even better in press releases. Victoria's father, Harrison Whitfield III, greeted them in his mahogany-paneled office, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who'd built their wealth on cotton and maintained it through careful reinvestment and strategic marriages. The older man had the silver-haired dignity of old money, the kind of presence that commanded rooms without effort. "Alexander, good to see you, son," Harrison said, extending a firm handshake. "Victoria's been telling me about your ideas for modernizing our operation. Sounds like exactly the kind of forward-thinking partnership we need." Victoria smiled, her red lips perfect as always, but Alexander noticed how her eyes remained cold when they talked about the families who'd worked this land for generations. She spoke about transitioning out inefficient operators and maximizing productivity through strategic consolidation, in the same tone she might use to discuss rearranging furniture. "What about the tenant farmers?" Alexander asked. "The families who've been working these fields for decades. "Oh, we'll provide generous transition assistance," Victoria replied, waving a manicured hand dismissively. "Help them find positions elsewhere, maybe provide some job training. Most of them aren't really equipped for modern agricultural practices anyway." Something cold settled in Alexander's chest at her casual dismissal of lives and livelihoods. These weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet or obstacles to profit margins. They were people with children and mortgages and dreams that mattered as much as any boardroom ambitions. After the meeting, Victoria suggested they tour some of the properties that would be affected by their modernization plans. She wanted Alexander to see the operational challenges firsthand, to understand why change was necessary. They drove through rolling hills, where small farmhouses dotted the landscape like memories of an earlier time, each one representing a family whose future hung in the balance. That's when they came to the Johnson farm, where Clarence was loading feed sacks with movements that spoke of decades of repetition and recent exhaustion. Alexander watched through the car window as the older man struggled with weights that seemed heavier than they should be, his face etched with worry lines that had nothing to do with age. "That's one of our most problematic tenants," Victoria said, her voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to viewing people as problems. "Clarence Johnson. Been here forever, but his productivity has declined significantly. His operation is barely breaking even, and he's behind on his lease payments." Alexander studied Clarence's face, seeing something there that reminded him of his own grandfather, a man who'd worked himself to death trying to build something lasting for his family. There was dignity in the way Clarence moved, even in exhaustion, and a kind of quiet strength that spoke of battles fought and survived. "What happens to him if we modernize?" "Oh, we'll have to let him go, of course. Can't have sentiment interfering with business efficiency. Besides, he's got too much pride to accept the kind of help he actually needs." As Victoria spoke, Alexander noticed 3 children emerge from the farmhouse. A teenage boy with books under his arm, a young girl in clothes that had seen better days, and a little boy whose thin frame suggested that prosperity had not visited the Johnson family recently. The sight stirred something in Alexander that all his success and wealth had never touched, a recognition of what really mattered and what was truly at stake. The sun was setting by the time Clarence finished his evening chores, painting the Georgia sky in shades of orange and purple that Sarah had always loved. His children were inside doing homework by lamplight, trying to make the best of circumstances that seemed to grow more difficult with each passing day. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new impossible choices between pride and survival. In the barn, surrounded by the familiar smells of hay and honest work, Clarence finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of his failures. He thought about Marcus's college dreams, about Lily's growing awareness that they were different from other families, about little Samuel's clothes that hung too loose on his small frame. That's when the words came, whispered to empty stalls and silent shadows. "I can't feed them anymore." But the shadows weren't as empty as Clarence thought, and his whispered confession would set in motion events that would test everything he believed about dignity, pride, and the courage to accept help when it came from unexpected places. The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday morning that dawned grey and cold, carried by a sheriff's deputy who couldn't meet Clarence's eyes when he handed over the official papers. The document was crisp and white against Clarence's weathered palms, each typed word a nail in the coffin of everything he'd tried to build for his family. 60 days, the deputy said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry, Clarence, I truly am." Clarence stood in his doorway, still wearing his father's work boots, reading words that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Legal terminology wrapped around a simple, devastating truth. The Whitfield Agricultural Corporation was exercising its right to terminate his lease due to failure to meet financial obligations and declining operational efficiency. Behind him, he heard Lily's sharp intake of breath. She'd been setting the table for breakfast. 3 bowls, 3 spoons, the last of the cereal divided carefully to make sure everyone got something. Now she stood frozen, her 12-year-old mind struggling to understand what those official papers meant for their family. "Daddy?" Her voice was small, uncertain in a way that cut through Clarence's heart like a blade. "What does that mean?" Marcus appeared in the hallway, his school backpack slung over one shoulder, but his attention focused entirely on his father's face. At 16, he understood enough about bills and debts to recognize disaster when it came knocking. The college brochures he'd been studying the night before suddenly seemed like artifacts from someone else's life. "It means we got to find somewhere else to live," Clarence said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. He folded the papers carefully, as if handling them gently might somehow change their message. "But we got 60 days to figure it out." Young Samuel emerged from the bedroom, rubbing sleep from his eyes, unaware that his world had just shifted on its axis. He climbed onto his chair at the kitchen table and picked up his spoon, waiting for someone to pour his cereal. 8 years old, and still trusting that the adults in his life would somehow make everything work out. "Can we fight it?" Marcus asked, his mother's determination flickering in his dark eyes. "Can we get a lawyer or something?" Clarence looked at his eldest son, smart, capable, full of the kind of fire that could either forge steel or burn down everything in its path. How could he explain that lawyers cost money they didn't have, that the legal system was designed to protect people like the Whitfields, not families like theirs? "Sometimes fighting just makes things worse," Clarence said finally. "Sometimes you got to know when to fold your hand and try to find a different game." But Marcus wasn't ready to surrender. "I can drop out of school, get a full-time job. Coach Williams knows people in town, maybe." "No." The word came out sharper than Clarence intended, echoing off the kitchen walls like a gunshot. "You're going to finish school, son. Your mama would haunt me if I let you throw away your education for this." The mention of Sarah hung in the air. Between them, a presence both comforting and heartbreaking. She'd had such plans for their children, such fierce determination that they would have chances she never got. College for Marcus, art classes for Lily, opportunities that stretched beyond the boundaries of Whitfield County. Later that morning, after the children had reluctantly gone to school, Clarence walked the boundaries of the farm that had been his. Whole world for 37 years. Every fence post, every gate, every path between the pig pens held memories of sweat and hope and small victories that had seemed so important at the time. He found Victoria Whitfield waiting by the main barn, a red BMW convertible parked incongruously beside the rusted farm truck that Clarence kept running through prayer and spare parts. She wore white jeans and a crimson blazer that probably cost more than Clarence made in a month. Her blonde hair perfect despite the morning breeze. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice carrying the practiced sympathy of someone who'd never experienced real hardship. "I wanted to speak with you personally about the lease termination. I hope you understand it's nothing personal." Clarence studied her face, looking for some trace of genuine human emotion beneath the polished surface. She was beautiful in the way that money could manufacture. Straight teeth, clear skin, clothes that fit perfectly because they were made to order. But her eyes held the same cold calculation he'd seen in her father. "Nothing personal," he repeated, tasting the words like something bitter. 37 years of working this land, and it's nothing personal. "The agricultural business has changed, Mr. Johnson. We need operations that can adapt to modern methods, embrace new technologies. I'm sure you can understand the economics involved." What Clarence understood was that Victoria Whitfield had never missed a meal in her life, never worn hand-me-down clothes, never watched her children's eyes dim with hunger. She spoke about economics, like they were abstract concepts rather than the difference between hope and despair for families like his. "Maybe you can understand something for me," Clarence said, his voice steady but his hands trembling slightly. Maybe you can understand what it's like to look at your children and know you can't provide for them anymore. Maybe you can understand what it's like to work every day of your adult life for someone else's family while yours goes without. Victoria's perfect composure flickered for just a moment, something uncomfortable passing across her features. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the kind of professional politeness that put distance between uncomfortable truths and comfortable lies. I'm sure you'll land on your feet, Mr. Johnson. People like you always do. People like you. But the phrase hung in the air between them, loaded with assumptions and prejudices that Victoria probably didn't even recognize in herself. She saw Clarence as a type rather than an individual, a problem to be managed rather than a human being whose life was being shattered by her family's business decisions. That's when Alexander Langston emerged from the shadows of the barn, his expensive suit somehow managing to look appropriate in the rural setting. He'd been examining the facilities, supposedly assessing their potential for modernization, but his attention had been drawn to the conversation between Victoria and Clarence. "Victoria," Alexander said, his voice carrying a warning that made her stiffen. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," but Victoria was beyond the reach of subtle warnings, intoxicated by her own power and the opportunity to demonstrate her business acumen to her wealthy fiancé. She turned back to Clarence with the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Mr. Johnson, I want to be clear about something. Your lease termination isn't just about missed payments or declining productivity. It's about attitude. You have to understand that in the modern agricultural economy, there's no place for workers who can't adapt to new realities." "Victoria." Alexander started, but she cut him off with a raised hand. "The truth is, people in your situation often lack the initiative to improve their circumstances. You've been given opportunities, resources, time to turn things around. The fact that you haven't suggests a certain laziness that we simply can't afford to subsidize anymore." The word hit Clarence like a physical blow. Lazy. 37 years of sunrise to sunset labor, of working through illness and injury and grief, of sacrificing his own needs for the sake of his family and the animals in his care. Lazy Alexander stepped forward, his face flushed with something that looked like anger. "That's enough, Victoria." But the damage was done. Clarence felt something break inside him, something that had held him together through his wife's death and years of struggle, and countless small humiliations. The careful dignity he'd maintained, the quiet strength that had carried him through decades of inequality and disrespect, cracked under the weight of Victoria's casual cruelty. "Lazy," he repeated, his voice barely audible. 37 years. "And I'm lazy." Victoria seemed to realize she'd gone too far, but pride prevented her from backing down. "I'm simply being honest about the situation, Mr. Johnson. Sometimes honesty is more helpful than false encouragement." Alexander watched Clarence's face, saw the moment when hope finally died in the older man's eyes. It was a look he recognized from his own mirror during the worst moments of his life. The expression of someone who'd run out of fight, who'd reached the end of their ability to pretend that everything would somehow work out. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the farm that would soon belong to someone else, Clarence stood in the barn, where 3 generations of his family had worked and dreamed and struggled. The eviction notice was folded in his shirt pocket, a paper monument to failure that he'd carry until he found the courage to tell his children what came next. "I can't feed them anymore," he whispered to the empty stalls and silent shadows. "God, help me, I just can't feed them anymore." But the shadows weren't empty, and his whispered confession would change everything for both the man who spoke it and the one who heard it. The morning after the eviction notice arrived, Clarence Johnson walked into downtown Whitfield with Sarah's old recipe box tucked under his arm. The wooden container held more than just her handwritten cards for cornbread and sweet potato pie. It held memories of Sunday dinners, when the table groaned under the weight of abundance, when their children's laughter filled the house like music, when the future seemed as certain as sunrise. Now, sitting in the waiting room of Whitfield County's unemployment office, Clarence clutched the recipe box like a lifeline. Inside those faded index cards, Sarah had written more than ingredients and cooking times. She'd written notes about their dreams. Marcus's graduation cake, doctor or engineer. Lily's birthday, save for art supplies. Samuel's favorites, maybe he'll be a chef someday. The unemployment counselor, a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Patterson, reviewed Clarence's work history with the kind of professional sympathy that came from seeing too many desperate people. 37 years with Whitfield Agricultural Corporation. High school education. No technical certifications. Age 58. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice gentle but realistic. "The job market is challenging for someone in your situation. Most agricultural positions are going to younger workers with different educational backgrounds." Clarence nodded, understanding the careful language. Too old, too black, too much baggage for employers who wanted clean resumes and no complications. He'd known men like himself who'd spent months searching for work that paid half what they'd earned before, if they found anything at all. At the Piggly Wiggly grocery store, the manager, a young man barely older than Marcus, glanced at Clarence's application with barely concealed skepticism. "Do you have any retail experience, sir?" 37 years of customer service, Clarence replied, thinking about all the buyers and inspectors and corporate representatives he'd dealt with over the decades. 37 years of managing inventory, maintaining equipment, supervising operations. But the manager saw only what was written on paper. Farm worker, no college degree, probably desperate. "We'll call you if something opens up," he said, though they both knew the phone would never ring. The pattern repeated itself at the hardware store, the auto parts shop, the small factory on the outskirts of town. Each rejection was polite, but final. Each interviewer's eyes sliding away from Clarence's steady gaze, each handshake a little too quick, a little too dismissive. Meanwhile, 20 miles away, Alexander Langston sat in his hotel room overlooking the Whitfield town square, researching agricultural investment opportunities on his laptop. But his mind kept drifting to Clarence Johnson's face, to the moment when Victoria's cruelty had broken something essential in the older man's spirit. Alexander understood struggle, though his version had been different. His father, Richard Langston, had built a technology empire through ruthless ambition, crushing smaller companies and exploiting workers in the name of progress and profit. Alexander had inherited the money, but not the stomach for his father's methods. Every success felt tainted by the knowledge of how the foundation had been built. Now, engaged to Victoria Whitfield, Alexander found himself part of another empire, built on the backs of families like the Johnsons. The realization sat in his stomach like spoiled food, making him question everything he'd convinced himself he believed about business and success. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Daddy wants to discuss the modernization timeline. Can you meet us at the club for lunch?" Alexander stared at the message, imagining the conversation. Polite discussions about profit margins and efficiency improvements, with no mention of the families whose lives would be disrupted. He typed back, "I need to do some more research. First, rain check?" Instead of driving to the country club, Alexander found himself back at the Johnson farm, parking his Mercedes beside the mailbox and walking toward the house. He wasn't sure what he intended to say, only that he needed to understand what Victoria's plans would actually cost, in human terms. He found Marcus Johnson working in the garden behind the farmhouse, pulling up the last of the summer vegetables with careful efficiency. The boy moved with his father's deliberate grace, but Alexander could see anger in the set of his shoulders, frustration in the way he attacked the weeds. "You're Mr. Langston," Marcus said without looking up. "Victoria's fiancé." "I am." Alexander studied the teenager's face, seeing intelligence and determination tempered by circumstances beyond his control. "I wanted to talk to your father about the farm situation." Marcus straightened, wiping dirt from his hands on jeans that had been patched more than once. "My father's in town, looking for work. Not that anyone's going to hire him." The words carried bitter knowledge that no 16-year-old should possess. "You know what the worst part is? He blames himself, thinks he failed us somehow." "What do you think?" "I think the system's rigged," Marcus said, his voice steady, but his eyes blazing. "I think people like your fiancé make decisions in boardrooms that destroy families they'll never meet, and then they sleep fine at night because they never have to see the consequences." Alexander felt the accusation hit home. How many business-y decisions had he made from the comfortable distance of profit projections and market analysis? How many families had been affected by his investments without him ever knowing their names or stories? "What if there was another way?" Alexander asked. "What if the land could be saved, your family could stay?" Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "With what, magic? We don't have money for lawyers. We don't have political connections. We just have work ethic and pride. And apparently that's not enough anymore." That evening, Alexander sat in his hotel room with financial reports spread across the bed, calculating numbers that could change the Johnson family's fate. The math was actually straightforward: clearing their debt, modernizing the operation, providing startup capital for sustainable improvements. It was pocket change compared to his usual investments, but it would mean everything to Clarence and his children. The question wasn't whether he could afford to help. The question was whether he could afford not to. His phone rang. Victoria's name lighting up the screen. He let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message. "Alexander, darling, you missed a lovely lunch. Daddy has some exciting news about accelerating our timeline. Call me back." Instead, Alexander called his attorney, a sharp-eyed woman who specialized in agricultural law and had helped him navigate complex land deals before. "I need you to research something," he said. "I want to understand the legal options for preserving family farm operations in Georgia. Specifically, I want to know about partnership structures that could protect tenant farmers from displacement." "That's an unusual request," his attorney replied. "Most of our clients are looking to consolidate operations, not preserve them. Maybe it's time for something different." As Alexander hung up the phone, he thought about his father's legacy: companies built and destroyed, fortunes made at other people's expense, a name that commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Richard Langston had believed that business was war, that success required casualties, that sentiment was the enemy of profit. But sitting in that hotel room, surrounded by reports about agricultural efficiency and modernization plans, Alexander wondered if there might be a different way to measure success. Maybe wealth meant more than what you accumulated. Maybe legacy meant more than what you left behind. Maybe the truest measure of a man was found not in what he took, but in what he gave back. Outside his window, the lights of Whitfield twinkled like stars, each one representing a family, a story, a dream, hanging in the balance. Somewhere out there, Clarence Johnson was probably lying awake, staring at the ceiling and wondering how to tell his children that their world was about to change forever. But change could work in more than one direction, and sometimes the most unlikely partnerships could bloom from the darkest circumstances. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning when hope felt like a luxury the Johnson family could no longer afford. Marcus held the envelope with trembling fingers, his name printed in official university letterhead that seemed to glow with possibility. Georgia Tech's seal embossed in gold, the weight of the paper speaking of institutions and opportunities and futures that stretched beyond the red clay boundaries of Whitfield County. "Well?" Lily asked, bouncing on her toes beside the kitchen table where breakfast dishes sat forgotten. Even 8-year-old Samuel had stopped eating his cereal, sensing the importance of whatever his big brother held in his hands. Marcus tore open the envelope with careful precision, as if handling it gently might influence its contents. His eyes moved across the formal language, past the congratulations and technical details, straight to the heart of what mattered: full academic scholarship, engineering program, acceptance pending final confirmation. "I got it," he whispered, then louder, his voice cracking with emotion. "I got the scholarship. Full ride." Clarence felt his chest swell with pride so fierce it almost knocked him down. His boy, Sarah's boy, smart enough and determined enough to earn what they could never afford to give him. For a moment, the eviction notice folded in his shirt pocket seemed less important than this golden ticket to a future none of them had dared to believe possible. But the moment passed as reality reasserted itself. College meant leaving home just when his family needed him most. It meant textbooks and fees and expenses that scholarships didn't cover. It meant trusting that somehow, without his help, Clarence could keep Lily and Samuel fed and housed and safe. "That's wonderful, son," Clarence said, his voice steady despite the war raging in his heart. "Your mama would be so proud." Marcus looked up from the letter, and Clarence saw his own thoughts reflected in his son's eyes. Triumph mixed with guilt, hope shadowed by responsibility. The boy understood what Clarence couldn't bring himself to say, that accepting this opportunity might mean abandoning his family when they needed him most. "Maybe I should defer for a year," Marcus said quietly. "Get a job, help with the situation here." "No." The word came out harder than Clarence intended, echoing his conversation with Alexander Langston that morning. "You're going to college, Marcus. Whatever else happens, you're going to college." That morning, Alexander had appeared at the farm with a proposal that sounded too good to be true. Partnership, he'd called it. Investment in sustainable agriculture, modernization of facilities, preservation of family operations. He'd stood in Clarence's kitchen, his expensive suit incongruous among the mismatched chairs and patched linoleum, speaking about business, plans and profit projections with the kind of calm confidence that came from never doubting your own success. "I'm not talking about charity," Alexander had insisted. "I'm talking about a legitimate business partnership. You provide the experience and labor, I provide the capital and connections. We split the profits according to a fair arrangement that recognizes your contribution." Clarence had listened with the polite attention he'd learned to show wealthy white men, nodding at appropriate moments while his mind catalogued all the ways such arrangements typically ended. He'd seen too many promises broken, too many handshake deals that disappeared when market conditions changed or new priorities emerged. "What's your fiancé think about this plan?" Clarence had asked, and he'd seen something shift in Alexander's expression. "Victoria doesn't need to be involved in every business decision I make," but Clarence knew better. He'd worked for the Whitfield family long enough to understand how power flowed through their world. Victoria might not control Alexander's money, but she influenced his social circle, his political connections, his access to the networks that made business partnerships succeed or fail. Now, watching Marcus struggle with his college decision, Clarence felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Accept Alexander's help and risk his family's future on the promise of a man he barely knew, or maintain his independence and watch his children's dreams crumble under the weight of circumstances beyond their control. That afternoon, Victoria Whitfield arrived at the farm unannounced, her red BMW kicking up dust clouds that settled on everything like a reminder of the distance between her world and theirs. She wore white again, white jeans, white blouse, white sunglasses that hid her eyes, as if the color could somehow establish her innocence in the disruption of their lives. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice carrying the kind of false sweetness that preceded bad news. "I understand my fiancé has been discussing some sort of business arrangement with you." Clarence nodded, unsure where the conversation was heading, but certain it wouldn't end well for his family. "I want you to understand something," Victoria continued, stepping closer with predatory grace. "Alexander is a good man, But he's also impressionable. He sees problems and wants to fix them, even when fixing them isn't in anyone's best interest. Whose best interest are we talking about? Victoria's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her sunglasses. Yours, actually. You see, arrangements like this rarely work out the way people hope. Partnerships require trust, and trust requires equality. The sad truth is that people from different backgrounds, different levels of education and experience, often find themselves incompatible when money is involved. She spoke with the casual authority of someone who'd never been challenged, never been forced to question her assumptions about how the world worked. But Clarence heard the threat beneath her polite words, the promise of consequences if he didn't. Play his assigned role in her family's drama. Alexander will lose interest, Victoria continued. He always does. And when that happens, you'll be worse off than you are now. At least currently, your situation is stable. You know where you stand. Stable, Clarence repeated, thinking about eviction notices and empty refrigerators and children who tried to hide their hunger behind bright smiles. I'm trying to protect you, Mr. Johnson. People like Alexander, they mean well, but they don't understand the complexities of situations like yours. They make promises they can't keep, create expectations that lead to disappointment. Clarence studied Victoria's face, seeing beneath the polished surface to something harder and more calculating. She wasn't trying to protect him. She was protecting her own interests, maintaining control over a situation that threatened to complicate her carefully ordered world. "What do you suggest I do?" he asked quietly. "Accept the inevitable with dignity. Take the transition assistance we're offering. Find a nice apartment in town. Let your children adjust to new realities. Fighting the current only exhausts you. Swimming with it can carry you to calmer waters." After Victoria left, Clarence sat on his front porch steps and watched his children play in the yard that would soon belong to someone else. Marcus was helping Samuel build a fort out of old boards and imagination, while Lily sketched pictures of the farm in a notebook that was missing half its pages. They looked so young, so trusting in their father's ability to somehow make everything work out. How could he tell them that their world was built on sand, that the ground beneath their feet was already shifting? That evening, Marcus found him in the barn where Sarah used to help with the evening chores. The boy had his mother's determined expression, the look that meant difficult conversations and decisions that couldn't be postponed. "I'm not going to college," Marcus announced, his voice steady but his hands shaking slightly. "I already talked to Coach Williams. He knows about some job openings at the processing plant in Macon. Good pay, benefits, enough to help support the family." Clarence felt something break inside his chest, a sound like Sarah's heart cracking all over again. All her dreams for their children, all her fierce determination that they would have chances she never got, crumbling under the weight of circumstances she'd never imagined. "Son." "No, Daddy. I've thought about this. College is a luxury we can't afford right now. Family comes first, and this family needs me to step up and be a man. Being a man doesn't mean throwing away your future. It means taking care of the people you love when they need you most." Marcus's words carried an echo of conversations Clarence had heard in his own father's voice, when pride and responsibility collided with dreams and possibility. 3 generations of Johnson men making the same impossible choices, sacrificing their own futures for the sake of family survival. What if there was another way? Clarence asked, thinking about Alexander's proposal, about partnerships and possibilities that seemed too good to be true. Like what? Clarence almost told him about Alexander's visit, about the business plan that could save the farm and preserve their family's place on land they'd worked for decades. But Victoria's warning echoed in his mind, along with years of experience that taught him to be suspicious of wealthy white men bearing gifts. "I don't know yet," he said finally, "but I need you to promise me something. Don't make any final decisions about college until we've exhausted every other option." "Can you do that?" Marcus nodded reluctantly. though Clarence could see the skepticism in his eyes. The boy had learned too early that hope was a dangerous luxury, that practical decisions mattered more than distant dreams. As night settled over the farm that had been their whole world, Clarence stood in the doorway of the barn and watched his children through the kitchen window. They were doing homework by lamplight, their heads bent over books and papers that represented futures he wasn't sure he could provide. Marcus's college acceptance letter lay on the kitchen table, golden opportunity mixed with impossible choices. In 60 days, they would have to leave this place that held 3 generations of memories and dreams. In 60 days, his children would learn whether their father was strong enough to find a new way forward or broken enough to accept defeat. Alexander Langston's business card sat in Clarence's shirt pocket, next to the eviction notice that had started this whole nightmare. 2 pieces of paper representing 2 very different futures for the Johnson family. The question was whether Clarence had enough faith left to believe that sometimes help could come from the most unexpected places, or whether pride and experience had taught him that in the end, a man could only depend on himself. Alexander Langston's father had carried the same business card for 30 years, cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing that announced Richard Langston, Chief Executive Officer, to a world that had learned to respect and fear the name. Now sitting in his hotel room at midnight, Alexander held that card between his fingers like a piece of evidence from a crime he was still trying to understand. He'd found it among his father's papers after the funeral, tucked inside a leather portfolio, along with contracts and correspondence that painted a picture of systematic exploitation. Small farms bought for pennies on the dollar when desperate families couldn't meet their obligations. Communities displaced for shopping centers and housing developments. Workers dismissed when they became inconvenient or expensive. Richard Langston had built an empire by recognizing opportunity where others saw only problems. He taught his son that sentiment was the enemy of success, that business was war, and that the strongest survived by making the hard choices weaker men couldn't stomach. But reading through those papers, Alexander had discovered something his father never intended him to see: how many of those hard choices had involved families like the Johnsons. People whose only crime was lacking the resources to fight back when powerful men decided their land was worth more than their lives. The next morning, Alexander drove to the Johnson farm with his attorney's preliminary research and a proposal that had kept him awake most of the night. He found Clarence in the pig barn, going through motions that had become ritual over 37 years, checking feeders, examining animals, maintaining equipment that someone else would inherit in 53 days. "Mr. Langston," Clarence said, without looking up from the fence he was repairing, "come to make another offer I can't refuse." "I came to show you something," Alexander replied, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "My attorney found some interesting information about this property's history." Clarence straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his hand. At 58, he still moved with the fluid grace of a man who'd spent his life in physical labor, but Alexander could see exhaustion in the set of his shoulders, defeat in the careful way he approached hope. "What kind of history?" Alexander opened the folder and spread papers across a hay bale that served as an impromptu table. Property deeds, court records, newspaper clippings from the 1920s and 1930s painted a picture of legal manipulation and systematic theft that made his stomach turn. "Your great-grandfather, Samuel Johnson Sr., owned this land," Alexander said, quietly. 200 acres, purchased legally in 1923, with money he'd saved from sharecropping and working in the lumber mills. He had clear title, paid property taxes, even registered with the county clerk. Clarence leaned closer, studying documents that seemed to glow with impossible possibilities. "That can't be right. My family's always worked for the Whitfields. We've never owned land. Look at this." Alexander pointed to a deed transfer dated 1934. "During the Depression, your great-grandfather fell behind on property taxes. The Whitfield family offered to help. paid the back taxes in exchange for a temporary lien on the property. But when Samuel tried to repay the debt, they claimed he'd actually sold them the land. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications that neither man wanted to voice. Clarence traced his finger along his great-grandfather's signature, the careful handwriting of a man who'd fought for dignity in a world determined to deny it. The court case lasted 2 years, Alexander continued. Samuel Johnson Sr. versus Whitfield Agricultural Corporation. Guess who won? The folks with better lawyers, Clarence said, his voice barely above a whisper. The folks with white skin and political connections, Alexander corrected. But here's the thing. The legal precedent was flawed. The statute of limitations doesn't apply to fraud. And if we can prove systematic deception— Why? Clarence interrupted, his eyes meeting Alexander's with an intensity that made the younger man step back. Why are you telling me this? What's in it for you? Alexander felt the weight of his father's business card in his pocket, the legacy of exploitation and cruelty that he'd inherited along with the money. How could he explain that helping Clarence felt like the first real choice he'd made in his adult life? How could he admit that saving this farm might be the only way to save his own soul? Maybe I'm tired of being my father's son, he said finally. Maybe I want to leave a different kind of legacy. Before Clarence could respond, Victoria's BMW appeared in the distance, kicking up dust clouds that announced her approach like a storm front. She parked beside Alexander's Mercedes and emerged wearing red this time. Red dress, red lipstick, red anger that painted her face with barely controlled fury. "Alexander!" she called, her voice carrying across the farmyard with the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "We need to talk. Now." She strode toward them with predatory grace, her heels clicking against the hard-packed earth, like a countdown to confrontation. Alexander saw Clarence step back instinctively, recognizing the kind of anger that came from privilege, challenged, and authority questioned. "I've been looking for you all morning," Victoria said, her eyes moving. Between Alexander and the documents spread across the hay bale. "Imagine my surprise when Daddy told me you've been asking questions about property records and historical land ownership." Alexander straightened, feeling the weight of his father's legacy pressing down on him like a physical force. "I'm researching a potential investment opportunity. Is that what we're calling it?" Victoria's laugh held no warmth, only the cutting edge of sarcasm honed by years of getting her own way. "Because from where I stand, it looks like you're trying to undermine my family's business interests for some misguided sense of social justice." The air between them crackled with tension. Years of unspoken assumptions and carefully maintained power structures suddenly exposed to harsh daylight. Clarence watched the exchange with the careful attention of someone who understood that his family's future hung in the balance of this wealthy couple's disagreement. "Your family's business interests," Alexander repeated slowly. "Built on what?" "Exactly." Victoria's perfect composure flickered for just a moment, revealing something hard and defensive beneath the polished surface. "Built on generations of hard work, smart investments, and the kind of strategic thinking that creates jobs and prosperity for entire communities. And if those strategic decisions happen to displace a few inconvenient families along the way, that's how progress works, Alexander. You can't make omelets without breaking eggs." "I thought you understood that." Alexander looked at Clarence, seeing in the older man's face the human cost of Victoria's casual metaphors. Broken eggs were real people, with children and dreams and dignities that mattered as much as any profit margin. "Maybe it's time for a different kind of progress," Alexander said quietly. Victoria's eyes flashed with something dangerous, a warning that she was prepared to fight for what she considered rightfully hers. "Be very careful, Alexander. You're talking about challenging arrangements that have been in place for decades, upsetting balances that benefit everyone involved. Everyone except the people who actually work the land. People like Mr. Johnson here are welcome to pursue other opportunities if they're not satisfied with current arrangements." No one's forcing them to stay. The cruelty of the statement hung in the air like smoke, poisoning everything it touched. Victoria spoke about displacement and economic violence as if they were minor inconveniences, as if families like the Johnsons could simply reinvent themselves whenever market forces demanded. Clarence cleared his throat, his voice steady despite the enormity of what was being discussed around him. Miss Whitfield, with all due respect, you're talking about my family's life like it's some kind of business transaction. These aren't just arrangements to us. This is our home, our history, our children's future. Victoria turned toward him with the kind of cold attention she might give to an interrupting servant. Mr. Johnson, I understand this is emotional for you, but emotions don't change economic realities. The agricultural business has evolved beyond small family operations. It's simply not sustainable anymore. Says who? Alexander interjected. Says the same people who profit from consolidation and mechanization. Says the same corporations that benefit when family farms fail. The battle lines were drawn now, invisible but unmistakable. On one side stood Victoria, and everything she represented: inherited privilege, systematic inequality, the comfortable assumption that power justified its own exercise. On the other stood Alexander and Clarence, unlikely allies united by a shared recognition that some things mattered more than profit margins. The question was whether good intentions and historical justice would be enough to overcome generations of institutional power and carefully constructed legal barriers. The answer would determine not just the fate of one small farm, but the kind of men Alexander and Clarence chose to be when the stakes were highest. The Victorian-era land deed Alexander discovered in the county courthouse archives was yellowed, with age and brittle as autumn leaves, but its legal language was clear enough to stop hearts and change destinies. Dated July 15, 1923, it declared in formal script that Samuel Johnson Sr. had purchased 200 acres, more or less, of prime agricultural land in Whitfield County for the sum of $800, a fortune for a black man in post-Reconstruction. Georgia, saved penny by penny from years of sharecropping and mill work. Look at this signature, Alexander's attorney, Margaret Chen, said as she photographed the document with careful precision. And compare it to this deed transfer from 1934. She laid the papers side by side, the 11-year gap between them telling a story of systematic theft that made Alexander's chest tighten with rage. The 1934 document bore the same name, Samuel Johnson Sr., but the handwriting was completely different. Where the original signature showed the careful, educated script of a man who'd taught himself to read and write, the later document displayed the shaky, uncertain marks of someone barely literate. They forged his signature, Alexander said, the words feeling heavy in his mouth, stole his land and forged his signature to make it legal. Margaret nodded grimly. It was a common practice during the Depression. Black landowners fell behind on property taxes. White businessmen offered to help, then used legal technicalities and forged documents to claim ownership. The victims rarely had resources to fight back, and even when they did, the courts weren't exactly sympathetic to their claims. Alexander thought about his father's business empire, built on similar opportunities and strategic acquisitions. How many other families had been destroyed by men like Richard Langston, who saw weakness as invitation and desperation as leverage? That evening, Alexander sat across from Clarence in the Johnson family's modest kitchen, watching the older man study copies of the documents that proved his great-grandfather's ownership of the land his family had worked for decades as tenant farmers. Marcus leaned over his father's shoulder, his 16-year-old mind racing through the implications, while Lily and Samuel played quietly in the corner, sensing the gravity of the adult conversation but not understanding its significance. It changes everything," Marcus said, his voice filled with an excitement that made Alexander's heart ache. "We can get our land back. We can fight them." But Clarence's expression remained cautious, marked by years of hard experience with white promises and legal documents that somehow never seemed to benefit families like his. "Paper's just paper," he said quietly. "Having the right doesn't mean having the power to claim it." "But this is proof," Alexander insisted. "Documented fraud, systematic theft. Any court would have to—" "Any court run by who?" Clarence interrupted gently. "Judges appointed by who? Politicians elected by who?" He looked at Alexander with eyes that held decades of accumulated wisdom about how justice actually worked in places like Whitfield County. "Mr. Langston, I appreciate what you're trying to do, I truly do. But you're thinking like someone who's never had to fight a system designed to keep you down." Alexander felt the truth of Clarence's words like a physical blow. Despite all his business success, all his education and connections, he was naive about the realities that shaped life for families like the Johnsons. Money and good intentions weren't always enough to overcome generations of institutional racism and legal manipulation. His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Daddy wants to meet with you tomorrow morning. Important business discussions." Alexander stared at the message, understanding that his research into the Johnson land ownership had not gone unnoticed. The Whitfield family was preparing to circle their wagons, to protect interests they'd built on stolen ground and forged signatures. Meanwhile, across town in the emergency room of Whitfield County Hospital, Dr. Sarah Martinez was treating 8-year-old Samuel Johnson for what his father had described as tiredness and not eating much. But the blood work told a different story. Anemia, malnutrition, and the kinds of deficiencies that came from months of inadequate nutrition. "Mr. Johnson," Dr. Martinez said gently, finding Clarence in the waiting room where he sat with his head in his hands, "I need to talk to you about Samuel's condition." Clarence looked up with eyes that had seen too much disappointment to hope for good news. "How bad is it?" "He's going to be fine," she said quickly, watching relief flood across his face. "But he's showing signs of nutritional deficiency that suggest he hasn't been getting enough protein, iron, and other essential nutrients." Has the family been experiencing food insecurity? The clinical language made their crisis sound manageable, like a problem that could be solved with proper planning and resource allocation. But Clarence heard the real question beneath the medical terminology. "Are you failing to feed your child?" "We've had some tough times lately," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I'm working on it. I'm going to fix it." Dr. Martinez nodded with professional sympathy, but Clarence could see the concern in her eyes. She'd probably seen too many families like his, caught between pride and desperation, choosing between rent money and grocery money, watching their children grow thin while trying to maintain dignity in a world that seemed designed to strip it away. "I'm going to prescribe some supplements," she said, "and I want to see Samuel back here in 2 weeks. In the meantime, there are programs available." "We'll be fine," Clarence interrupted, the words coming out sharper than he intended. "Thank you for taking care of my boy, but we'll be fine." As he drove Samuel home through the dark Georgia night, Clarence felt the weight of accumulated failures pressing down on him like a physical force. His great-grandfather's stolen land, his own inability to provide for his children, Marcus's deferred college dreams, and now his youngest son hospitalized because his father couldn't put enough food on the table. When they reached the farmhouse, Alexander's Mercedes was parked in the driveway and lights were on in the kitchen. Through the window, Clarence could see the Millionaire sitting at their table with Marcus and Lily, apparently helping with homework while waiting for their return. "Why's Mr. Langston here?" Samuel asked, his voice still weak from the hospital. "A visit?" "I don't know, son," Clarence replied, but as he watched Alexander patiently explaining something to Lily while Marcus worked on math problems beside them, he felt something shift in his chest. Here was a wealthy white man who could have been anywhere, doing anything, but he'd chosen to sit in their modest kitchen and help his children with schoolwork. Maybe, Clarence thought as he carried his exhausted son toward the house. Some white promises were different. Maybe some help came without strings attached. Maybe, just this once, pride was a luxury his family couldn't afford. But even as hope flickered to life in his chest, Clarence couldn't shake the memory of Dr. Martinez's concerned eyes, the clinical language that described his failures as a father, the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Victoria Whitfield's family would fight with everything they had to protect what they'd stolen. The question was whether justice delayed could ever become justice delivered, or whether some wrongs were too old and too deeply rooted to ever be set right. The medical test results arrived on a Tuesday morning that would divide Alexander Langston's life into before and after, into the time when death was a distant abstraction and the time when it became an unwelcome partner in every conversation. Dr. Patricia Reeves delivered the news in her office overlooking downtown Atlanta, her voice gentle but uncompromising in the way that only oncologists learn to master. "Stage 4, pancreatic cancer," she said, the words hanging in the air like smoke from a fire that couldn't be extinguished. "The scans show extensive metastasis to the liver and lymph nodes. I'm sorry, Alexander. I wish I had better news." Alexander sat in the leather chair across from her desk, his business suit suddenly feeling like a costume from someone else's life. 42 years old, worth more money than most people could spend in several lifetimes, and none of it mattered against the cellular rebellion happening inside his own body. "How long?" he asked, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. "With aggressive treatment, we might extend your life by 6 to 8 months. Without treatment," Dr. Reeves paused, her professional compassion warring with medical honesty. 3 to 4 months, possibly less. The silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of life continuing outside the window. Traffic, construction, the ordinary noise of a world that would keep turning after Alexander Langston was gone. He thought about all the plans he'd made, the business deals pending, the wedding Victoria had been planning for next spring. "I need to ask," Dr. Reeves continued, "do you have family? People who should know about this diagnosis?" Alexander almost laughed at the irony. Family. His parents were dead. His marriage had ended in bitter divorce, and his relationship with Victoria suddenly seemed as fragile as morning frost. The person he most wanted to talk to was a widowed pig farmer he'd met less than 2 weeks ago, a man whose struggles had somehow become more important to him than his own comfort. "I'll handle the notifications," he said, standing with careful deliberation. "Thank you for your honesty, Dr. Reeves." The drive back to Whitfield County felt like traveling through a landscape transformed by knowledge he couldn't unknow. Every billboard, every gas station, every mile marker became part of a countdown he'd never wanted to start. Alexander found himself noticing details he'd previously ignored. The way afternoon light painted the pine trees gold, the dignified poverty of small farmhouses, the simple beauty of a world he'd spent most of his life too busy to see. He drove straight to the Johnson farm, needing to be around people whose problems were immediate and solvable, whose crises didn't involve cellular betrayal and treatment protocols that would steal his remaining months in exchange for the possibility of a few more. He found Clarence in the pig barn, going through the evening routine that had structured his days for 37 years. The older man looked up with a smile that faded when he saw Alexander's expression. "Something wrong, Mr. Langston?" Alexander opened his mouth to deflect, to maintain the professional distance that had protected him through countless business negotiations. But standing in that barn, surrounded by the honest smells of hay and animals and decades of honest work, he found himself telling the truth. "I'm dying," he said simply. "Cancer. 3 to 4 months, maybe longer with treatment." Clarence set down the feed bucket he'd been carrying and studied Alexander's face with the kind of attention he usually reserved for sick animals or troubled children. Whatever he saw there made him nod slowly, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking into place. "That why you want to help us?" Clarence asked. "Dying man trying to buy his way into heaven?" The question was asked without judgment, with the gentle directness of someone who'd learned to cut through pretense to reach essential truths. Alexander considered it seriously, examining his own motivations with the clarity that terminal diagnosis can provide. Maybe partly, he admitted, but mostly because your family deserves better than what they've gotten, and I have the resources to help. If I'm going to die anyway, I'd rather die knowing I used my time for something that mattered. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two men from different worlds united by the recognition that time was finite and choices mattered. Outside, Alexander could hear the voices of Clarence's children, Marcus explaining something to Lily, while Samuel's laughter carried on the evening breeze. "What about Miss Victoria?" Clarence asked. "She going to support your decisions when she finds out about your condition?" Alexander thought about his fiancée, about the careful way she'd constructed their relationship around mutual benefit and social advantage. Victoria had fallen in love with his wealth and status, not with the man who'd earned them. Terminal illness would change everything about his value proposition. "I haven't told her yet," he said, "but I have a feeling the engagement won't survive." The news. That evening, Alexander sat in Victoria's family mansion, surrounded by portraits of ancestors who'd built their wealth on stolen land and forged documents. The house was beautiful in the way that old money could purchase. Antique furniture, crystal chandeliers, oil paintings that whispered of genteel southern heritage built on generations of exploitation. Victoria emerged from her father's study, wearing the kind of smile that preceded difficult conversations. She'd clearly been briefed on Alexander's recent activities, his research into property records and historical land ownership. "Darling," she said, settling beside him on the antique. "Zofa, Daddy and I have been talking about your little hobby project with the Johnson family. We understand you want to help, and it's admirable, truly, but we're concerned you might not understand all the complexities involved." Alexander felt the weight of his diagnosis settling into his bones, making everything else seem simultaneously more urgent and less important. "What complexities?" "Legal ones, primarily. The arrangements between our family and tenant farmers like the Johnsons have been in place for decades. They're built on established precedents, contractual obligations, and community understandings that benefit everyone involved." "Community understandings," Alexander repeated, tasting the euphemism like something bitter. "Is that what we're calling systematic theft now?" Victoria's perfect composure flickered, revealing something harder underneath. "I don't appreciate that tone, Alexander. My family has provided employment and housing for people like the Johnsons for generations. We've been good stewards of the land and fair employers to our workers, fair employers who forged documents and stole land from black families." "That's a very serious accusation," Harrison Whitfield said, emerging from his study with the kind of authoritative presence that had intimidated opponents for decades, and one that could have significant legal implications if repeated in the wrong contexts. Alexander looked at Victoria's father, seeing in his confident bearing the same casual cruelty that had destroyed Samuel Johnson Sr.'s dreams and stolen his children's inheritance. This was how power perpetuated itself, through intimidation, legal manipulation, and the comfortable assumption that victims would be too afraid or too poor to fight back. "Are you threatening me, Harrison?" "I'm advising you as family. Marriage isn't just about two people. It's about the joining of lives, fortunes, and interests. Victoria's interests are my interests, and both are tied to maintaining certain arrangements that your research seems designed to disrupt." Alexander felt something cold and certain settle in his chest. He looked at Victoria, seeing her not as the woman he'd planned to marry, but as the inheritor of a legacy built on cruelty and maintained through legal violence. "I need to tell you both something," he said quietly. "I have terminal cancer. 3 to 4 months to live, possibly longer with treatment." The silence that followed was telling in its quality. Victoria's face went through a complex series of expressions: shock, calculation, and something that might have been relief. Her father's expression remained carefully neutral, but Alexander could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. "Oh, Alexander," Victoria said finally, her voice carrying practiced sympathy. "I'm so sorry. This changes everything, doesn't it?" "Does it?" Alexander asked. "Does my diagnosis change anything about what's right or wrong? Does it change what your family stole from the Johnsons?" Victoria exchanged a glance with her father, a look that communicated volumes about shared priorities and calculated responses. "It changes your ability to follow through on commitments, darling. It changes the practical realities of any business partnerships you might be considering." Alexander understood then that his instincts about Victoria had been correct all along. She'd never loved him. She'd loved what he represented, what he could provide, what advantages his wealth could bring to her family's empire. Terminal illness made him a liability rather than an asset. "I think," he said carefully, "our engagement should be terminated along with my diagnosis." Victoria nodded with the kind of relief that confirmed everything he'd suspected about her feelings. "Perhaps that would be best, for both of us." As Alexander drove away from the Whitfield mansion for the last time, he felt something unexpected, not grief for the life he was losing, but clarity about the life he still had left to live. 3 to 4 months wasn't much time, but it was. Enough to right some wrongs, enough to ensure that the Johnson family got back what had been stolen from them. The question was whether a dying man's good intentions would be enough to overcome a century of institutional power and legal manipulation. The answer would depend on how far Alexander was willing to go to ensure his legacy meant more than the money he'd leave behind. Sarah's wedding ring had never left Clarence Johnson's finger in the 7 years since cancer took her. The simple gold band wearing smooth against his work-hardened skin, like a prayer said so often it became part of the flesh itself. Now sitting in the office of Whitfield County's only pawnshop, he turned the ring slowly around his finger while the owner, a thin man with sympathetic eyes, quoted him a price that would cover exactly 2 months of Samuel's medical expenses. "I can give you 400 for it," the man said gently. "Gold's down right now, but it's a nice piece, clean, well-maintained, $400, 37 years of marriage, reduced to a number that wouldn't even cover the cost of the nutritional supplements Dr. Martinez had prescribed for Samuel." Clarence looked at the ring, remembering the day he'd placed it on Sarah's finger in front of Bethel Baptist Church. Both of them young and foolish enough to believe that love and hard work were enough to overcome anything the world might throw at them. "I need to think about it," Clarence said, standing with the careful dignity that had carried him through decades of small humiliations and quiet victories. Outside the pawn shop, his phone buzzed with a text from Alexander. "Meet me at the courthouse. Urgent. Good news." Clarence drove through downtown Whitfield, past the Confederate monument that dominated the town square, past the banks and law offices where power concentrated like sediment in still water. The courthouse was an imposing structure of Georgia marble and deliberate intimidation, designed to remind visitors that justice was a privilege dispensed by those with the authority to grant or withhold it. He found Alexander in the law library. Surrounded by documents and legal books, his expensive suit wrinkled from hours of research. The millionaire looked thinner than he had just weeks ago, his face carrying new lines that spoke of pain, carefully managed, and time running out. "Clarence," Alexander said, standing with visible effort, "I've been working with Margaret Chen on the legal strategy. We think we've found something that could change everything." Margaret Chen looked up from her laptop, her expression cautiously optimistic. "The forgery of your great-grandfather's signature wasn't just theft, it was federal fraud. And because it involved interstate commerce and banking regulations, there's no statute of limitations." Clarence sat down heavily in one of the library chairs, feeling hope and skepticism warring in his chest. "What does that mean in plain English?" "It means we can file a federal lawsuit demanding the return of the land to your family." Alexander explained. But more than that, we can demand punitive damages for nearly a century of lost income, lost inheritance, lost opportunities. The numbers Margaret showed him were staggering. 90 years of rental income, agricultural profits, property appreciation, and compound interest added up to millions of dollars, enough to secure his children's futures, enough to send Marcus to college, enough to ensure that Samuel would never again be hospitalized for malnutrition. But there's a catch, Margaret continued, her voice carrying the cautious tone of a lawyer who'd seen too many promising cases collapse under the weight of practical realities. The Whitfield family won't go down without a fight. They have resources, political connections, and the kind of legal team that specializes in making problems disappear. What kind of fight are we talking about? Clarence asked. Character assassination, procedural challenges, attempts to discredit the evidence. They'll argue that you're trying to profit from ancient history, that your family was adequately compensated through decades of employment, that the documents could be forgeries themselves. Alexander leaned forward, his eyes bright with the kind of intensity that comes from having a deadline that can't be negotiated. That's why we need to move fast, file the lawsuit, get an injunction to stop the eviction, force them to respond before they can organize their full defense. And if we lose, Clarence asked, then you're no worse off than you are now, Margaret replied. But if we win, your family gets back what was always rightfully yours, Alexander finished. The land, the money, the future your great-grandfather dreamed of when he bought that property in 1923. That evening, Clarence sat at his kitchen table with his 3 children, the legal documents spread between them like maps to an uncertain territory. Marcus read through the papers with the kind of focused intensity he usually reserved for college preparation materials, while Lily tried to understand what it all meant for their family. "So we might get to stay?" she asked, her 12-year-old voice carrying hope that made Clarence's chest tight with love and fear. "We might," he said carefully, "but it's going to be a fight, baby girl, and fights like this, sometimes they get ugly before they get better." Marcus looked up from the legal briefs, his 16-year-old face serious beyond his years. "What about the college scholarship? The deadline for acceptance is next week." It was the question Clarence had been dreading, the impossible choice between his son's immediate future and the family's long-term salvation. If they lost the lawsuit, Marcus would need that scholarship more than ever. But if they won, if they actually got their land back, Marcus could choose college based on his dreams, rather than their desperation. "Accept the scholarship," Clarence said finally. "Whatever happens with this lawsuit, you're going to college, son. Your mama would never forgive me if I let you pass up that opportunity." But even as he spoke the words, Clarence felt the weight of another impossible choice pressing down on him. The legal fees alone would consume what little savings they had left. Alexander had offered to cover the costs, but accepting that help felt like mortgaging their pride to purchase hope. Meanwhile, across town, Victoria Whitfield sat in her father's study, reviewing the legal documents that Margaret Chen had filed. That morning, the lawsuit was methodical and devastating, each claim supported by historical evidence that painted her family's legacy in the harsh light of truth. "This is more serious than we initially thought," her father's attorney said, his voice carrying the gravitas of someone who specialized in making problems disappear. "The evidence of fraud is actually quite compelling, and the federal jurisdiction complicates our usual strategies." Harrison Whitfield III leaned back in his leather chair, his silver hair catching the light from the desk lamp that had illuminated 3 generations of family business decisions. "What are our options?" "Several approaches," the attorney replied, opening a folder thick with investigative reports and character assessments. "We can challenge the authenticity of the documents, question the chain of custody, argue that the statute of limitations applies despite the federal fraud claims." "What about the plaintiff?" Victoria asked. "Clarence Johnson himself, surely there are vulnerabilities we can exploit." The attorney consulted his notes with the clinical detachment of a surgeon examining a patient. Single father, recently behind on lease payments. Son applying for financial aid for college. He's vulnerable, but he's also sympathetic. A jury would probably see him as the underdog. Then we don't let it get to a jury, Harrison said quietly. What about Alexander Langston? What's his angle in this? Victoria's expression hardened at the mention of her former fiancé. Terminal cancer, 3 to 4 months to live. He's apparently trying to buy his way into heaven by championing lost causes. Dying men can be dangerous, the attorney observed. They have nothing left to lose and everything to prove. But his condition also creates opportunities. Medical emergencies, cognitive impairment from treatment, questions about his competency to make business decisions. The conversation continued late into the night, a strategic planning session that treated human lives like chess pieces to be sacrificed in service of a larger game. They discussed private investigators, media manipulation, political pressure, and legal maneuvers that would turn the Johnson family's pursuit of justice into a public relations nightmare. But in the Johnson farmhouse, a different kind of planning was taking place. Alexander had arrived after dinner, his face drawn with pain, but his eyes bright with determination. He sat at their kitchen table, helping Samuel with his reading homework, while Marcus and Clarence discussed the legal strategy. "There's something else you need to know," Alexander said as Samuel ran off to play with his toys. "I've been in contact with journalists at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the Washington Post. They're interested in the story, not just the legal case, but the broader pattern of land theft that affected black farmers throughout the South." Clarence felt a chill run down his spine. "You're talking about making this public?" "I'm talking about making sure the Whitfield family can't bury this case in procedural delays and backroom deals. Public attention changes the dynamics. It makes it harder for them to use their usual tactics. It also makes it harder for us to live quiet lives if we lose," Marcus pointed out. Alexander nodded, acknowledging the risk. "That's why it has to be your decision, Clarence. I can provide the resources and legal support, but this is your family's fight. You get to decide how far you're willing to go." Outside, the October wind rattled the windows of the farmhouse that might not be theirs much longer. In 32 days, the eviction would take effect, unless they could stop it through legal action. In 3 to 4 months, Alexander Langston would probably be dead, leaving the Johnson family to face the consequences of choices made in hope and desperation. But tonight, sitting around that kitchen table where 3 generations of Johnson children had done their homework and shared their dreams, the future felt full of possibility rather than despair. Tonight, for the first time in years, Clarence allowed himself to believe that sometimes justice delayed could still become justice delivered. The question was whether they had enough time and courage to see it through to the end. The original farm deed from 1889 lay on the plaintiff's table like an accusation written in fading ink. Its legal language declaring that Samuel Johnson Sr. had purchased 200 acres, more or less, situated in the 3rd District of Whitfield County, for the price of $800, a fortune for a newly freed slave, saved penny by the penny from years of sharecropping and determination. Federal Judge Patricia Morrison reviewed the document with the careful attention of someone who understood that history was being written in her courtroom. The case of Johnson versus Whitfield Agricultural Corporation had drawn national media attention, filling the gallery with reporters and civil rights observers who recognized the broader implications of what was being decided. Victoria Whitfield sat in the front row behind the defense table, her red dress a deliberate choice that seemed to announce her refusal to be intimidated by proceedings that threatened to unravel 4 generations of her family's legacy. Her attorney, Thomas Bradford, a man whose expensive suit and silver hair spoke of decades spent defending the indefensible, shuffled through documents with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case that mattered to the right people. "Your Honor," Bradford began, his voice carrying the kind of Southern authority that had intimidated countless opponents. "This case represents nothing more than an opportunistic attempt to profit from ancient history. The plaintiff seeks to overturn nearly a century of settled property arrangements based on allegations that cannot be proven and documents that may themselves be fraudulent." Margaret Chen rose from the plaintiff's table with quiet dignity, her research folders organized with the precision of someone who'd spent months preparing for this moment. "Your Honor, this case is about documented fraud, systematic theft, and the federal government's obligation to protect the property rights of all citizens, regardless of race or economic status." Judge Morrison nodded toward Margaret. "Proceed with your opening statement, Counselor." In 1923, Samuel Johnson Sr. purchased 200 acres of prime agricultural land in Whitfield County, Georgia. He paid fair market value, received clear title, and worked that land for 11 years until the Great Depression forced him to fall behind on property taxes. The Whitfield family offered to help by paying the back taxes in exchange for a temporary lien on the property. Margaret walked to the evidence table and lifted the 1934 deed transfer, holding it so the gallery could see the shaky signature that bore no resemblance to Samuel Johnson Sr.'s educated handwriting. Instead of honoring their agreement, the Whitfield family forged Mr. Johnson's signature on a deed transfer, stealing his land through legal fraud. For 90 years, they've profited from that theft while the Johnson family worked as tenant farmers on land that rightfully belonged to them. Clarence watched from the plaintiff's table, his hands folded carefully in his lap, trying to project the dignity his great-grandfather had carried through life, despite systematic attempts to strip it away. Beside him, Alexander looked pale but determined, his terminal diagnosis adding urgency to every moment of the proceedings. Bradford stood for his opening statement, his strategy immediately clear in his dismissive tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are asked to believe that a barely literate sharecropper in 1923 possessed the sophistication to purchase 200 acres of prime farmland. We are asked to accept documents that have conveniently appeared after decades of supposed loss, brought forward by a plaintiff who faces eviction and has every motivation to fabricate claims of historical injustice. The truth is simpler and less dramatic than opposing counsel suggests. Samuel Johnson Sr. was a tenant farmer who worked land owned by the Whitfield family. When economic circumstances made it impossible for him to continue that arrangement, the Whitfield family provided transition assistance and employment opportunities that sustained his family for generations. Margaret called her first witness, Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, a handwriting expert from Emory University, who had spent weeks analyzing the disputed signatures. Her testimony was methodical and devastating, comparing the fluid, educated script of Samuel Johnson Sr.'s authentic signature with the crude forgery on the 1934 deed transfer. "The differences are dramatic and consistent," Dr. Hartwell explained, using projected images to show the jury. "The authentic signature demonstrates the handwriting of someone with formal education, while the forged signature shows hesitation marks, tremor patterns, and letter formations consistent with someone attempting to copy unfamiliar script." Bradford's cross-examination was aggressive but ineffective, his attempts to discredit Dr. Hartwell's credentials falling flat against her obvious expertise and careful methodology. The morning's most powerful testimony came from Reverend James Washington, an 87-year-old pastor whose grandfather had known Samuel Johnson Sr. personally. His voice carried the weight of lived history as he described the systematic theft of black-owned land throughout the South during the Depression era. "My grandfather told me stories about Samuel Johnson Sr., Reverend Washington said, his words carrying across the silent courtroom. "Told me he was one of the smartest men he ever knew, could read and write better than most white folks. Samuel saved every penny for 11 years to buy that land, treated it like it was sacred ground because he knew what it meant for his children and grandchildren to own something that couldn't be taken away. The Reverend's eyes found Clarence in the courtroom, except it was taken away through tricks and lies and forged papers. Samuel Johnson Sr. died a broken man, knowing his life's work had been stolen and there wasn't anything he could do about it. Bradford objected to the testimony as hearsay, but Judge Morrison allowed it to stand as historical context, recognizing the broader patterns of land theft that had affected black farmers throughout the South. As the morning session ended, Clarence felt the weight of his great-grandfather's dreams pressing down on him like a physical force. Justice delayed for 90 years, finally getting its day in court, but facing opponents who had spent 4 generations perfecting the art of legal theft and systematic oppression. The question was whether truth and evidence would be enough to overcome money, power, and the comfortable assumption that some injustices were too old to matter anymore. Judge Patricia Morrison's voice carried the weight of history as she delivered her ruling, each word measured and deliberate in the hushed courtroom where 4 generations of injustice waited to be answered. Alexander's final will and testament lay on the plaintiff's table, signed just hours before the hearing, despite his attorney's objections and his own failing health. In the matter of Johnson versus Whitfield Agricultural Corporation, Judge Morrison began, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade through old lies. This court finds clear and convincing evidence of systematic fraud perpetrated against Samuel Johnson Sr. and his descendants. Clarence felt his chest tighten with something that might have been hope, but he'd learned too much about disappointment to trust the feeling completely. Beside him, Alexander swayed slightly in his chair, the cancer treatments and courtroom stress taking their toll on his already weakened body. The handwriting analysis presented by Dr. Hartwell demonstrates beyond reasonable doubt that the 1934 deed transfer bears a forged signature. The historical testimony provided by Reverend Washington and others establishes a pattern of land theft that affected black farmers throughout the South during the Depression era. Victoria Whitfield's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, her red dress now seeming like a flag of surrender rather than defiance. Her father sat beside her with the rigid composure of a man watching his empire crumble, his silver hair catching the courtroom lights like tarnished metal. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, the evidence shows that the Whitfield family knowingly profited from this fraud for 90 years, collecting rental income and agricultural profits from land they had stolen through forged documents and legal manipulation. Alexander struggled to his feet as the judge spoke, his expensive suit hanging loose on his diminished frame. The terminal diagnosis had ravaged his body over the past weeks, but his eyes burned with the satisfaction of a man who'd lived to see justice finally delivered. Therefore, this court orders the immediate return of the disputed property to the Johnson family, along with compensatory damages in the amount of $2.3 million, representing 90 years of lost income and agricultural profits. The courtroom erupted in whispers and muted celebration from the gallery where civil rights observers and journalists had gathered to witness what many considered a landmark case. Margaret Chen smiled with professional satisfaction, but Clarence found himself thinking about his great-grandfather, wondering if Samuel Johnson Sr.'s spirit could somehow witness this moment of vindication. Additionally, Judge Morrison continued, her voice rising above the courtroom noise, this court awards punitive damages in the amount of $1.7 million intended to deter similar acts of fraud and to acknowledge the broader social harm caused by systematic land theft targeting black farmers. $4 million, enough to secure his children's futures, enough to send Marcus to college without debt, enough to ensure that Samuel would never again be hospitalized for malnutrition. Clarence looked at his hands, the same weathered palms that had worked stolen land for 37 years, and tried to comprehend that justice could actually triumph after nearly a century of delay. But even as victory settled around him like a warm coat, Clarence watched Alexander collapse into his chair, his face grey with exhaustion and pain. The millionaire had pushed himself beyond his physical limits to see this case through, and the cost was written in every laboured breath. The ayes, injunction against eviction is hereby made permanent, Judge Morrison concluded. Mr. Johnson, you and your family are restored to your rightful ownership of the property that was stolen from your great-grandfather in 1934. As the courtroom began to empty, Alexander managed to stand one more time, his hand trembling as he reached into his briefcase for the legal documents he'd prepared in anticipation of this moment. The will was comprehensive and carefully crafted, ensuring that the business partnership he'd envisioned with Clarence would survive his death. "This isn't charity," Alexander said quietly, his voice barely audible above the celebration around them. "It's an investment in the kind of future my father never could have imagined." The partnership documents transferred additional capital for farm modernization, sustainable agriculture initiatives, and educational trust funds for Clarence's children. More than money, it represented a vision of cooperation that transcended the racial and economic barriers that had divided men like them for generations. "Why?" Clarence asked, the same question he'd posed weeks ago when a stranger had first offered to help his family. "Why does our future matter to you?" Alexander smiled with the peaceful expression of a man who'd found meaning in his final acts. "Because legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what grows from the seeds you plant. Because sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to heal the living." Victoria Whitfield stood slowly, her perfect composure finally cracking under the weight of public humiliation and financial catastrophe. The woman who dismissed Clarence as lazy and worthless now faced federal fraud charges and civil lawsuits that would consume what remained of her family's empire. "This isn't over," she said, her voice carrying the desperate edge of someone who'd never learned to lose gracefully. "We'll appeal, we'll fight this until—" "Until what?" Alexander interrupted, his dying man's clarity cutting through her denial like sunlight through shadows. "Until you've spent every penny your family stole, defending the indefensible. Until you've proven that some people really are too proud to admit when they're wrong." As they left the courthouse together, Clarence felt the weight of his great-grandfather's dreams finally lifting from his shoulders. Samuel Johnson Sr.'s land was coming home to his family, along with the dignity that had been stolen with forged signatures and legal lies. Alexander walked slowly beside him, each step a victory over the cancer that would claim him soon enough. But today, under the Georgia sun that had witnessed so much injustice over the years, two unlikely friends had proven that sometimes the arc of the moral universe really does bend toward justice, especially when good people refuse to let it bend alone. 6 months after Judge Morrison's ruling changed everything, Marcus Johnson's graduation photograph sat on the mantelpiece of the farmhouse that had finally become home in the fullest sense of the word. He wore the cap and gown of Georgia Institute of Technology, his engineering degree earned not through desperate scholarship applications, but through the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your family's future is secure. The photograph was surrounded by other symbols of transformation. Lily's art pieces, no longer sketched in notebooks with missing pages, but painted on real canvases with proper supplies, displayed her growing talent for capturing the beauty in everyday rural life. Samuel's latest report card showed steady improvement in all subjects, his energy and focus restored by proper nutrition and the kind of stability that had seemed impossible just months before. But the center of the mantelpiece belonged to Alexander Langston's memorial photograph, taken during the farm's dedication ceremony when he'd still been strong enough to cut the ribbon on the sustainable agriculture center that bore his name. He'd lived 4 months longer than Dr. Reeves had predicted, long enough to see the Johnson farm transform from struggling tenant operation to model of community-supported agriculture. Clarence stood in the morning light streaming through kitchen, windows that Sarah had loved, watching his children prepare for another day in lives that had expanded beyond the boundaries of mere survival. Marcus was home for summer break before starting his master's program, working alongside his father to implement the environmental innovations that Alexander's partnership had made possible. The farm itself had become something neither Clarence nor his great-grandfather could have imagined. Solar panels powered efficient irrigation systems that turned Georgia clay into productive soil regardless of drought conditions. The pig operation had expanded into heritage breeds that commanded premium prices from Atlanta restaurants seeking authentic Southern ingredients. A farm store showcased Lily's artwork alongside locally produced goods, creating jobs for neighbors who'd once faced the same economic pressures that had nearly destroyed the Johnson family. "Daddy, the reporter from the Journal-Constitution is here," Lily called from the front porch, her 12-year-old voice carrying new confidence that came from knowing her art was valued and her family was secure. The journalist was writing a follow-up story about the case that had established legal precedent for addressing historical land theft throughout the South. Dozens of similar lawsuits had been filed in the 6 months since Judge Morrison's ruling, each one citing Johnson versus Whitfield as evidence that justice delayed didn't have to mean justice denied. "Mr. Johnson," the reporter said, settling into the same kitchen chair where Alexander had once sat, helping Samuel with his reading, "How has your life changed since the court ruling?" Clarence considered the question, while pouring coffee into cups that had once been reserved for special occasions. "How do you measure the transformation from desperation to dignity? How do you quantify the difference between children who go to bed hungry and children who dream about their futures without fear?" "The biggest change isn't the money," he said finally. "It's the peace. For the first time in my adult life, I go to sleep knowing my children will have chances I never had. That's worth more than any dollar amount." The sustainable agriculture program Alexander had endowed was training young farmers throughout the region, teaching them methods that could make small operations profitable in an economy dominated by corporate agribusiness. Marcus spent his summers working with these programs, using his engineering training to design systems that honored traditional farming wisdom while embracing modern efficiency. "What would you say to other families facing similar situations?" the reporter asked. Clarence thought about Victoria Whitfield, who'd fled to Europe after federal fraud charges destroyed what remained of her family's reputation. Her father had died of a heart attack during the appeals process, taking to his grave secrets about other land thefts and forged documents that would never be exposed. "I'd say that justice is possible, but it requires courage," Clarence replied. "It requires believing that truth matters more than power, that right can overcome might if good people are willing to stand up and fight." Alexander's experimental treatments had failed in the end, but he'd lived long enough to see the farm's first harvest under Johnson ownership, long enough to watch Samuel gain weight and energy, long enough to attend Marcus's high school graduation, and help plan his college education. He died peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by nurses he'd befriended and leaving behind a legacy that would outlive the cancer that killed him. The Alexander Langston Foundation continued his work, funding legal challenges to historical land theft and supporting sustainable agriculture initiatives throughout the South. Margaret Chen had become its chief legal counsel, dedicating her career to cases like the Johnson lawsuit that restored justice to families who'd been systematically robbed of their heritage. "Do you ever think about your great-grandfather?" the reporter asked as their interview concluded. Clarence nodded, his eyes moving to the original 1889 deed that now hung framed above the kitchen table where 4 generations of Johnson children had done their homework and shared their dreams. "Every day I think about how he saved for 11 years to buy this land, how he believed in America's promise that hard work and determination could build something lasting for his family. I think about how that promise was broken by people who saw his success as a threat to their own power. But mostly, I think about how he'd feel knowing that his great-grandchildren finally got to come home to land that was always rightfully theirs. As the reporter drove away, Clarence walked the boundaries of the farm that Samuel Johnson Sr. had purchased with such hope and determination in 1923. Every fence post, every gate, every path between the fields now carried the weight of vindicated dreams and restored dignity. The soil beneath his feet held the bones of ancestors who'd worked this land as slaves, as sharecroppers, as tenant farmers, and now, finally, as owners whose children could inherit not just property, but the pride that came with it. The red clay that had witnessed so much injustice had also absorbed the tears of joy when Judge Morrison read her verdict, when justice finally came home to the Johnson farm. In the distance, Marcus and Samuel worked together in the vegetable garden, the 16-year-old age gap between them bridged by shared excitement about seeds and seasons and the simple miracle of things growing in good soil. Watching them, Clarence felt Sarah's presence like sunlight on his shoulders, her dreams for their children finally taking root in earth that would never again be stolen from them. The cycle was complete, the circle closed, the promise kept. Samuel Johnson Sr.'s land had come home to his family, carrying with it the possibility that justice delayed could still become justice delivered for anyone brave enough to believe that truth was stronger than lies, that right was more powerful than might, and that love could triumph over even the deepest wounds that history could inflict.